There is a quiet power that awakens the moment you stop reacting, not the kind of indifference that numbs the heart, but a deeper stillness that comes from understanding the inner world. Most people believe life shapes them, that events, words, and circumstances decide who they become. Yet the psyche does not work that way. What truly governs a human being is not what happens, but what is assimilated within. When you act as if nothing affects you, you are not denying reality, you are refusing to let the unconscious rule your responses. The outer world constantly seeks entry into your inner life. Opinions, judgments, praise, rejection, chaos, and noise knock endlessly at the door of the mind. When every knock is answered, the self becomes fragmented. Emotional reactions multiply, identity weakens, and a person slowly forgets who is responding and who is being invaded. To act unaffected is to reclaim the boundary between the conscious self and the forces that attempt to possess it. This does not mean suppressing emotion. Suppression drives feelings into the shadow, where they grow distorted and powerful. True unaffectedness is awareness without entanglement. You notice anger arise, but you do not become anger. You sense fear, but you do not surrender your will to it. You observe admiration, insult, or threat as psychological phenomena, not commands. In this observation, the ego strengthens rather than dissolves. Something subtle begins to occur when reactions cease. People expect predictable responses. They rely on your triggers, your defenses, your wounds. When these no longer appear, confusion sets in. The external world loses its leverage, not because it has changed, but because its access has been denied. You are no longer a mirror reflecting chaos. You become a surface that absorbs nothing unnecessary. Within this state, the psyche reorganizes itself. Energy once wasted on emotional reflexes returns inward. Clarity replaces compulsion. You begin to see patterns rather than events, motives rather than words, symbols rather than offenses. This shift from reaction to perception marks the beginning of inner authority. You stop being lived by unconscious content and begin to live consciously. The greatest disturbances often come from what is unresolved within. What angers you points to something unintegrated. What wounds you reveals an old, complex, demanding recognition. When nothing appears to affect you, these inner figures lose their power to act autonomously. They are seen, named, and gradually integrated. The psyche moves toward wholeness, not through struggle, but through no-identification. As this inner alignment deepens, the outer world responds differently. Conflict weakens because it requires participation. Manipulation fails because it needs emotional hooks. Even adversity changes its shape, no longer personal, no longer defining. You stand in a place where events pass through awareness without carving your identity. There is also a transformation in presence. Calm becomes magnetic. Silence speaks louder than defense. People sense something ungraspable, a solidity that cannot be provoked. This is not superiority, it is individuation. You are no longer acting from borrowed emotions or collective fears. You are acting from a center that is your own. In this state, life does not become empty. It becomes meaningful. Joy is experienced without dependency. Pain is acknowledged without collapse. Love is given without possession. You are not detached from life. You are rooted in yourself. And from this root, action becomes deliberate rather than reactive. To act as if nothing affects you is not to escape life, but to meet it without losing yourself. When this happens, the unconscious begins to cooperate instead of sabotage. The mind grows quieter, intuition sharper, decisions cleaner. You discover that peace was never about controlling the world, only about mastering the point at which the world enters you. Emotion. Non-reaction is not the absence of feeling, but the refusal to be possessed by feeling. Most people live as though their emotions are commands rather than signals, as though every inner movement demands immediate expression. When an emotion arises, the personality rushes to justify it, defend it, or project it outward. This habit creates a fragile inner structure, because anything from the outside can collapse it. A single word, a look, a memory, or a minor event gains the power to disturb the entire psyche. Inner authority is lost the moment reaction replaces awareness. To restore inner authority, one must first understand how reaction forms. Reaction is born from unconscious material that has not been examined or integrated. Old wounds, unresolved conflicts, inherited beliefs, and collective fears lie dormant beneath the surface of the conscious mind. When an external event touches one of these hidden contents, the response feels immediate and uncontrollable. The individual believes they are responding to the present moment, while in truth they are reliving something ancient within themselves. Emotional non-reaction interrupts this cycle by creating space between stimulus and response, allowing consciousness to intervene where habit once ruled. This space is not empty. It is filled with observation. When a feeling arises and is not acted upon, it becomes visible. The individual begins to see emotion as an object within the psyche rather than the voice of the self. Anger can be watched as energy, fear as sensation, sadness as weight. In this observation, the emotion loses its absolute authority. It no longer dictates behavior, identity, or meaning. Instead of saying, "I am angry," the psyche learns to say anger is present. This shift seems subtle, yet it marks the return of inner sovereignty. Inner authority does not come from dominance over others or control of circumstances. It emerges when the ego stops being overrun by unconscious forces. Emotional reactions often feel justified because they carry intensity. Intensity creates the illusion of truth. The stronger the feeling, the more certain the mind becomes that it must be right. Emotional non-reaction exposes this illusion. It reveals that intensity is not wisdom, and urgency is not insight. By not reacting, the individual allows deeper understanding to surface, an understanding that is quieter, slower, and far more accurate. When emotional non-reaction becomes a practiced state, the psyche begins to reorganize itself. Energy previously wasted on defensive behaviors returns inward. The nervous system settles. Thought becomes clearer. Decisions are no longer rushed to relieve discomfort. This internal stability strengthens the ego, not as arrogance, but as coherence. The self becomes less fragmented because it is no longer constantly torn between opposing emotions. Inner authority grows naturally when the psyche experiences itself as capable of holding emotion without collapsing into it. There is resistance to this process, often intense. The unconscious fears being exposed. Emotional reactions have served as protective mechanisms, disguising vulnerability, fear, or emptiness. When reaction is withdrawn, what lies beneath becomes visible. This can feel unsettling, as though one is standing without armor. Yet this exposure is precisely where strength is found. Inner authority is not built by hiding weakness, but by enduring awareness of it without escape. As emotional non-reaction deepens, projection diminishes. The individual stops attributing their inner turmoil to others. Insults lose their sting because they no longer confirm hidden self-doubts. Praise loses its intoxicating power because worth is no longer externally negotiated. The psyche becomes self-referential rather than approval-dependent. This independence is often misunderstood as coldness, yet it is the warmth of self-containment. One no longer demands that the world regulate inner balance. Relationship change under this condition. Conflict requires emotional participation. When reaction is absent, conflict has nothing to feed on. Manipulation fails because it depends on predictable emotional triggers. Even hostility weakens as it cannot find resonance. This does not mean passivity. Action still occurs, but it arises from choice rather than compulsion. Words are spoken because they are necessary, not because they are emotionally charged. Inner authority also transforms suffering. Pain is no longer dramatized into identity. Loss, disappointment, and uncertainty are experienced fully, yet they do not define the self. The individual learns that pain can exist without becoming the center of consciousness. This realization is liberating. Life retains its depth without overwhelming the psyche. Emotional non-reaction does not flatten experience. It gives it proportion. Over time, a quiet confidence develops. Not the loud confidence of assertion, but the silent confidence of self-trust. The individual knows that whatever arises internally can be faced without immediate discharge. This knowledge creates resilience. The psyche no longer fears its own contents. Emotional storms may come, but they are known to pass. Inner authority rests on this certainty, the certainty that the self is larger than any single emotional state. In this state, perception sharpens. Without the distortion of reaction, reality appears more accurately. Motives are seen clearly, patterns recognized, intentions understood, without paranoia or idealization. The individual is less deceived by appearances because emotional urgency no longer clouds judgment. This clarity is a direct expression of inner authority, the capacity to see without distortion and act without inner conflict. Emotional non-reaction is therefore not withdrawal from life, but a deeper engagement with it. It is the discipline of remaining inwardly present while the world moves. The self becomes anchored rather than tossed by circumstance. From this anchoring, decisions gain weight, silence gains meaning, and presence gains power. The individual is no longer governed by what happens, but by how consciously it is received. Awareness without identification is the moment the psyche learns to see itself. Most suffering does not arise from experience itself, but from the unconscious fusion between the observer and what is observed. Thoughts, emotions, impulses, and fears arise within the mind, and almost immediately the individual claims them as identity. The phrase, "this is how I am," is silently repeated, and the psyche becomes trapped inside its own content. When awareness is present without identification, this fusion dissolves. What once controlled the individual becomes something that can be examined. Unconscious control thrives on invisibility. Anything that remains unseen acts with autonomy. Emotional reactions, compulsive thoughts, recurring patterns, and irrational fears operate most powerfully when they are mistaken for the self. The mind obeys them because it believes they are its own voice. Awareness introduces light into this hidden territory. The moment something is seen clearly, it loses the right to command blindly. Identification is what gives unconscious material its authority. To be aware without identifying does not mean rejecting inner experiences. Rejection strengthens them. The psyche resists suppression and returns with greater force. Awareness is a form of psychological hospitality without submission. A thought is allowed to appear, but it is not obeyed. An emotion is felt, but it is not acted out. A fear is acknowledged, but it does not dictate movement. This stance creates an inner separation that is not division, but differentiation. Differentiation is essential for psychological maturity. Without it, the individual remains merged with every inner fluctuation. One moment confident, the next defeated. One moment loving, the next resentful. Identity shift constantly because it is built on temporary states. Awareness without identification stabilizes identity by relocating it from content to consciousness itself. The individual no longer asks, "What am I feeling?" to know who they are. They know who they are by the fact that they are aware. This shift weakens unconscious control gradually but decisively. Complexes lose energy when they are observed without emotional reinforcement. They rely on reaction, on belief, on identification. When awareness watches without judgment or indulgence, the complex is deprived of nourishment. It still exists, but it no longer dominates. Over time, its intensity fades, not because it was fought, but because it was no longer mistaken for truth. The mind often resists this process because identification feels safe. Even painful identities feel familiar. Letting go of identification can feel like losing oneself. There is a fear of emptiness, of not knowing who one is without emotions, roles, or narratives. Yet this emptiness is not absence, it is space. In this space, something more stable begins to form. The psyche discovers a center that is not reactive, not fragile, not dependent on constant validation. Awareness without identification also reveals the symbolic nature of inner experiences. Emotions are no longer taken literally. Anger may point to violated boundaries. Fear may indicate unexplored potential. Sadness may signal a necessary psychological ending. When identification drops, interpretation becomes possible. Inner life transforms from chaos into communication. The unconscious stops shouting and starts speaking. This process requires patience. The habit of identification has been built over years, often reinforced by family, culture, and collective beliefs. The individual has been taught to define themselves by thoughts, emotions, achievements, and failures. Awareness challenges this conditioning silently. Each moment of non-identification weakens the old structure, strengthens the observing consciousness. This is not dramatic. It is subtle and cumulative. As unconscious control weakens, choice returns. Behavior becomes less automatic. The gap between impulse and action widens just enough for reflection. In that gap, freedom exists. The individual can choose not to repeat old patterns, not because of moral effort, but because the inner compulsion has lost its grip. Awareness stands between desire and action like a quiet guardian. Relationships are deeply affected by this change. When identification governs, others easily trigger unconscious reactions. A word ignites anger. A gesture awakens insecurity. Silence creates abandonment. When awareness is present, these triggers are noticed rather than enacted. The individual no longer hands emotional control to others. This does not create emotional distance, but emotional responsibility. One stops demanding that others regulate inner states. The weakening of unconscious control also brings humility. Awareness reveals how little of the psyche was previously conscious. It exposes projections, illusions, and self-deception. This is not shaming, it is grounding. The individual stops clinging to a fixed self-image and becomes more flexible, more human. Inner authority grows precisely because the ego is no longer inflated by false certainty. Over time, awareness without identification creates an inner stillness that is not passive. It is alert, receptive, and grounded. Thoughts continue, emotions arise, life unfolds. Yet there is a center that remains untouched. From this center, perception becomes clear and action becomes intentional. The unconscious does not disappear, but it no longer governs from the shadows. It becomes a source of insight rather than disturbance. Boundaries between the inner and outer worlds are not walls but thresholds, places where experience is translated rather than absorbed raw. Psychological weakness often begins where these boundaries are porous or confused. The individual allows external events to pass directly into the core of identity, mistaking circumstance for meaning and opinion for truth. When the outer world is given unrestricted access to the inner life, the psyche becomes overcrowded. Voices that are not one's own begin to speak with authority, and the sense of self fragments under constant intrusion. The outer world is relentless in its demands. It offers expectations, judgments, comparisons, urgencies, and noise. Without a clear boundary, the psyche reacts as though each of these were a direct threat or command. Emotional exhaustion follows, not because life is unbearable, but because there is no inner filter. Everything is taken personally, immediately, and absolute. Psychological strength begins when the individual learns that not everything that arrives from the outside deserves entry into the inner sanctum. The inner world is a living system with its own rhythm, symbols, and processes. It requires protection to function coherently. When boundaries are absent, the inner world becomes reactive rather than generative. Creativity dries up, reflection disappears, and instinct turns defensive. The psyche becomes an echo chamber for external pressures instead of a source of meaning. Establishing boundaries restores the inner world's autonomy, allowing it to respond rather than react. A boundary does not deny reality. It regulates relationship. The individual still perceives events, hears words, and recognizes circumstance, but these are processed consciously instead of absorbed emotionally. An insult can be recognized without becoming self-definition. A failure can be evaluated without collapsing into shame. Praise can be received without inflation. The boundary acts as a psychological membrane, allowing information to pass while preserving integrity. Many confuse boundaries with detachment or coldness. In truth, the absence of boundaries creates emotional volatility, not depth. When the inner world is constantly invaded, emotions become exaggerated and unstable. With boundaries, feeling gains proportion. One can care deeply without losing oneself. One can engage fully without surrendering inner balance. Psychological strength is measured not by intensity of emotion but by capacity to contain it. The formation of boundaries often begins with discomfort. The psyche has grown accustomed to overexposure. External validation, conflict, and stimulation have filled inner silence. When boundaries are established, there is a sudden quiet. This quiet can feel unsettling, even lonely. The individual may mistake it for emptiness. In reality, it is space, a space in which the inner world can finally speak in its own language. Without boundaries, projection dominates perception. The individual attributes inner conflicts to outer figures. Authority figures carry unresolved parental dynamics. Partners become carriers of unmet needs. Strangers provoke disproportionate reactions. Boundaries interrupt projection by forcing inner content to remain inside long enough to be recognized. Psychological strength grows as responsibility for inner states is reclaimed. A clear boundary also protects against emotional contagion. Moods, fears, and anxieties spread easily in collective environments. Without awareness, the individual absorbs the emotional atmosphere and mistakes it for personal truth. Boundaries allow one to sense collective emotion without being consumed by it. One can move through chaos without internalizing it. This capacity is essential for leadership, creativity, and inner stability. The inner world requires time and solitude to integrate experience. When boundaries are weak, reflection is constantly interrupted. There is no pause between experience and reaction. Strength arises when the individual allows experiences to settle before assigning meaning. This pause creates depth. It allows symbols to emerge instead of conclusions. The psyche digests reality rather than choking on it. Boundaries also redefine responsibility. The individual stops assuming responsibility for others' emotions and stops granting others responsibility for their own. This shift is liberating and frightening. It removes familiar roles of rescuer, victim, or opponent. Psychological strength emerges as the individual stands alone within their inner world, not isolated, but self-contained. The boundary between inner and outer worlds clarifies choice. Without it, behavior is dictated by external pressure or internal compulsion. With it, action becomes deliberate. One can decide when to engage and when to withdraw, when to speak and when to remain silent. Silence itself becomes a form of strength, not avoidance, but containment. As boundaries stabilize, the inner world gains coherence. Contradictory impulses can coexist without chaos. Ambivalence is tolerated rather than resolved prematurely. This tolerance increases maturity. The individual no longer needs immediate certainty to feel secure. Psychological strength includes the ability to live with unanswered questions without surrendering inner balance. The outer world responds differently to someone with clear boundaries. Manipulation weakens because it finds no entry point. Conflict loses intensity because it is not mirrored internally. Respect emerges not because of force, but because of consistency. Others sense where the individual ends and where they themselves begin. This clarity creates trust, even in disagreement. Ultimately, boundaries allow the inner world to become a source rather than a refuge. Instead of retreating inward to escape life, the individual draws from the inner world to meet it. Meaning flows outward, not inward chaos. Psychological strength reveals itself as quiet resilience, the ability to remain inwardly ordered while the external world shifts, demands, and challenges. Inner integration is not an act of force, but a process of recognition. The psyche is composed of many parts, impulses, tendencies, memories, and contradictions that often operate independently of one another. When these parts remain unacknowledged, they compete for expression through the outer world. The individual experiences repeated conflicts, misunderstandings, and obstacles, believing them to be caused by fate or others, while they are often reflections of an inner division seeking resolution. The world responds not only to conscious intention but to unconscious alignment. What is fragmented within tends to manifest as resistance without. When desires are split by fear, when values are contradicted by hidden motives, action becomes unclear and outcomes unstable. Inner integration aligns these opposing forces. It does not eliminate tension but gives it a center. From that center, action becomes coherent, and the outer world begins to respond with less friction. Unintegrated aspects of the psyche often appear in distorted forms. Qualities rejected within oneself are encountered repeatedly in others. Aggression, vulnerability, dependency, or ambition are projected outward and met as conflict or attraction. The individual feels pursued or obstructed by these qualities in life, unaware that they are encountering parts of themselves. Integration withdraws these projections. As inner figures are accepted, the outer world loses its exaggerated charge. Acceptance does not mean indulgence. To integrate is not to act out every impulse, but to acknowledge its existence and purpose. Each rejected part carries energy and intention. When denied, that energy turns against the personality, creating anxiety, compulsions, or sabotage. When recognized, it becomes available for constructive expression. The psyche becomes an ally rather than an adversary. As integration deepens, perception of the world changes. Events are no longer experienced as random or hostile, but as meaningful responses to inner orientation. Challenges appear where growth is needed. Opportunities arise where readiness exists. This does not imply control over life, but participation in it. The individual is no longer merely reacting to circumstances, but engaging in a dialogue between inner state and outer reality. The outer world mirrors inner consistency. When the psyche is divided, signals sent outward are contradictory. One part seeks closeness while another fears it. One part desires change while another clings to safety. The world responds with mixed outcomes, reinforcing confusion. As inner integration progresses, intention becomes singular, decisions gain weight. The environment responds with clarity because it is meeting a unified presence. Inner integration also alters the experience of resistance. Obstacles no longer feel purely external. They are recognized as feedback. This recognition reduces resentment and increases learning. The individual stops asking why life is against them and begins to ask what within them has not yet been aligned. This shift transforms struggle into inquiry. Relationships reveal integration most clearly. When inner divisions remain unresolved, relationships become arenas for unconscious conflict. Partners carry disowned traits, replay old dynamics, or trigger intense emotional responses. As integration occurs, these patterns weaken. The individual attracts different kinds of interactions not by intention alone but by psychological resonance. The outer world reorganizes itself around the new inner configuration. Integration requires enduring inner tension without premature resolution. The psyche seeks wholeness, not comfort. Opposing qualities must be held together long enough for a new synthesis to emerge. This capacity develops patience and depth. The individual no longer rushes to define, label, or escape inner conflict. This inner stability influences how the world responds. Situations take on a different tone when met without inner urgency. As integration advances, the individual's presence changes. There is less need to convince, defend, or dominate. Action becomes simpler and more effective. The outer world senses this coherence. Authority is attributed naturally, without assertion. This is not power over others, but alignment within oneself, which others intuitively recognize. Inner integration also softens the relationship with uncertainty. When the psyche is unified, uncertainty does not threaten identity. The individual can move forward without complete knowledge, trusting the inner compass rather than external guarantees. This trust alters engagement with life. Risk is taken with discernment rather than desperation. The world responds to this steadiness with openings that were previously inaccessible. The transformation of outer circumstances is often subtle. Not everything changes, but the way it is encountered does. Situations that once provoked struggle lose intensity. Paths that were blocked reveal alternatives. People who resonated with inner conflict drift away, while those aligned with inner coherence appear. The world reflects integration not as reward, but as correspondence. Inner integration is an ongoing process. New layers emerge as consciousness deepens. Each integration refines the dialogue between inner and outer worlds. Life becomes less about control and more about participation. The individual stands neither against the world nor dissolved into it, but in relationship with it, grounded in an inner wholeness that quietly shapes what unfolds.